So, welcome to the second talk of the seventh annual Creativity Conference, sponsored by the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity. I really appreciate that our first talk put the finger on the creativity problem, but Dean doesn't have to do that. I first met Dean in 1987 when Dean came to the University of Memphis to give a paper. You were a young professor at Notre Dame at that point. Notre Dame?
No, I didn't move there till 1991.
You were on your way to Notre Dame.
Yeah, maybe.
But you came to a conference.
Yeah, I definitely went to
You
Memphis.
came to a conference in Memphis, and that's when I first saw you.
Yeah.
Then the next time I saw him was about 2 years ago in Lublin. But
Took us a while.
it took us a while to sort of get back together. But I have to say, I was incredibly impressed. And here's what went through my mind. It's like, if this guy is so important at his young age, and by the way, you look exactly the same as you did.
Well, there's a painting in my
There's
attic.
a painting in your audience.
You should see that.
So if this young guy can do this, then I am inspired. Because what Dean Zimmerman is he's a creative metaphysician. He's somebody who puts forward the ideas that seem to him to be viable and seem to him to be true. And I saw that when I saw you back in Memphis in the 1980s, and I thought, I was inspired, to be honest with you, Dean. I was inspired because you were so bold and you were so confident and you were so able to defend what you but then when people disagreed, you were able to handle that as well. So I learned a lot from that. And I have been learning, even though I haven't seen you in person that much, I have been learning from that ever since. Because if you've got a view and you've got an argument and you've got a position, then what you should do is what Dean Zimmerman has done in his career. There's a reason that he has succeeded, and the reason he has succeeded is because he steps forward, he says what he thinks, and then he listens. And this is a great virtue for anybody who wants to be a philosopher. And with that, Dean Zimmerman.
Wow. That's the finest introduction I've ever received. Well, I want to say any virtue along those lines that I've acquired, I should give a lot of credit to Roderick Chisholm, who was my great teacher, and he was never as excited and proud of a student as when they refuted him. He always tried to get his thesis clear enough so that you could see whether it was going to hold up, and he you could sort of see his eyes light up when you showed him he was wrong about something. So I look forward to your efforts, and I'll try to model the equanimity and so on, the teachability that Chisholm showed. Okay, so I'm gonna try to shift the content just a little bit. So giving this talk at the conference on space, time, and motion at SLU, I did quite a bit on timelessness and the deity because I knew Eleanor Stump was going to be there, and we have this ongoing, thing where I say, "Oh, okay, I see. By timeless, you mean blah blah blah," and then she says, "No, that's not what I mean." So I'll do a little bit less of that here, though, because this is going online. I'm afraid she'll watch it and refute me again. Okay. So let me say a little bit about the project here. There's sort of one thing I'm interested in is omnipresence. So the idea that there's a deity who's present everywhere. What does that mean? So I'm interested in sort of providing tools for people who want to develop a theory about that notion, and give them options. but I'm also really interested in it, for its own sake, in the question of what is location? What is it for a thing to be located somewhere? So I'm looking at different theories about that. In the past, people have given kind of causal theories. So what's more fundamental than some kind of primitive of being located somewhere is standing in a direct causal relation to a place. And you get to be at a place because that's where you have immediate unmediated effects. But these days, people tend to take space-time as just a fundamental thing that we need. It has to have structure of its own, metrical structure, all kinds of structure that follows from that, and we need it to be differently shaped in different places because that's how we explain gravity. So in discussions of the last 20 years or so, or more, you have space-time taken seriously as a thing in its own right. But then, of course, doesn't seem like that's the only thing there is, although there are some people who are super substantivalists who say, really, there's just space-time and it's differently warped. You can go back to Clifford. He said, he tried to develop a theory like that. What's that called? Geometrodynamic theories of matter. But most people think that's, well, it hasn't been worked out successfully. And most people think, well, we need space-time. It's got some structure. We need matter. We need fields. We need particles. Who knows exactly what we need, right? But we've got some contents that have to be located in the space-time. And at any given instant, you can ask, what's the shape of space then? Okay, forget about relativity for a moment. Pretend there's a privileged way of slicing up the manifold. At any given instant, you got a three-dimensional space, and then there's the contents of that space, whether it's fields or particles or what have you. And so the literature that I'm reading and responding to, reacting to, takes this kind of dualist picture of space and space occupiers. And the space occupiers, well, they've got to be somehow related to this, to the space that they're in. Okay, so that's a slightly different picture than you have in the medieval period, and I'm going to be in conversation with some medieval philosophers here, but most of them, most of the the sort of the big names in the Christian medieval tradition, they would have accepted that there has to be a plenum, which is kind of like, in a way, it's kind of like having space. But there's a plenum of material stuff, and it's differently propertied in different places. Some places it's real solid, and other places it's real viscous. But there's no holes anywhere in it. It's everywhere, and the place of a thing is identified in an Aristotelian sort of way with its surround, with the parts of the plenum that surround the thing. That's its place. So that's quite a different different picture, but maybe not all that different. I don't know if I'll get around to talking about how important the difference is, but okay. So the contemporary discussants of here are people like Chris McDaniel, the late lamented Josh Parsons, who really helped inaugurate the discussion of location as an important metaphysical topic. Cody Gilmore, Hud Hudson. So they're all metaphysicians, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to offer, not primarily to theologians, but to people who are trying to think about fundamental nature of the physical world, a story about what is the basic relation in virtue of which the contents of space or space-time are related to space. And Josh Parsons started this discussion with a lovely paper, and there's a nice long quote from it on your handout that I'll read to you. What he's pointing out is that when you talk about location or occupation, and you're trying to figure out what's the basic notion that's going to kind of correspond to the fundamental metaphysics here, you've got a family of notions, and they're interdefinable. This is a nice little introduction of the way he's thinking about them. So this is the beginning of the handout there. Let us say that I am weakly located in my office, if and only if I am in my office in the weakest possible sense. If and only if my office is not completely free of me. I should count as weakly located in my office when I am sitting at my desk, when I am reaching an arm out of the window, or when I am reaching an arm in the window from the street outside. Let us say that I am entirely located in my office and everywhere in my office, if and only if I am in my office and I am not anywhere outside my office. That is, if and only if I am in my office and everywhere outside my office is completely free of me. I am entirely in my office when I am sitting at the desk, but not when I am reaching an arm in or out of my window. Let us say that I pervade or am pervasively located in any place none of which is free of me. I don't ever pervade my office, thankfully. That would be a very small office. But I do pervade the region exactly occupied by my left big toe. Finally, I am exactly located anywhere that I am both entirely and pervasively located. My exact location is like my shadow in substantival space. Okay, Parsons thinks those are all the location notions we need. There's a further question we could ask, well, which one of them is the basic one? Parsons himself doesn't want to answer that question. He thinks, why not suppose it's just a family? It's one happy family. I'm kind of more of a where's the fundamental relation guy. I want one of these to be more basic. Let's, and I'll be assuming that we are kind of looking for a most fundamental location relation. So I'm going to proceed in one of the ways that Parsons suggests, defining all of them except for weak location in terms of weak location. Okay? But it'll give you an idea of what Parsons' framework is like. And then I want to try to explain a different framework where the fundamental location relation behaves differently, and ask, why do they want that? And what do they think is important about this difference? So, because there's going to be two proposals for exact location, and they behave differently, I'm going to give them different names. So what Josh Parsons calls maximal, or rather, what he calls exact location, I'm going to call maximally exact location. Okay, so that's definition one there. X is maximally exactly located at R, some region. That's supposed to mean for every region S, R overlaps S if and only if X is weakly located at S. This is going to pick up the maximal location of a thing. Okay, to take a case that's going to be kind of important, or it's going to be driving some intuitions here, you've got a simple particle, let's say. You throw it into a time machine and send it back to meet itself in the past. Okay, so you've got one and the same thing showing up in two places. Its exact location in Parsons' sense has to be the sum of these 2 points. So wherever the thing is at a given time, it's got to be part of its maximally exact location. Okay, and pervasion, you can define that in terms of weak location as well. X pervades R. That means for every region S such that R overlaps S, X is weakly located at S. So it's filling up this region. Now, pervasion is consistent with overfilling. You can pervade a region and stick out of it. But there's no absence of you anywhere in that region if you pervade the region. X is wholly located within R. That means, that's a notion that he didn't really introduce here, but it's the idea that there's no part of you missing from the region. And in that sense, the particle that you sent time traveling back to meet itself, if you put one particle in one box and the same particle in another box, the particle is wholly located over here, because the thing over here is just it. So that's an interesting notion, and it's one that is going to the other people we're going to talk about are they think that it's very important that you can have something wholly located in one place, and when you do, it might be wholly located somewhere else, and they want to say there's a notion of exact location which will allow you to say each is exactly located just in its box, but we'll get to that. Okay, now if you're interested in omnipresence, you want to know whether something could be everywhere, and if so, in what sense? You know, what does that even mean? Now, there's a grand tradition in Christian theology, anyway, of saying, the sense in which God is omnipresent is very indirect. You know, God has power over everything that's at every place. God sustains everything in existence, so God is causally related to every place. God's supposed to know everything that's going on. That's pretty good, you know, that's pretty impressive. Isn't that enough? Enough for God to be omnipresent? But it does have God being present in a very derivative sense. Present in virtue of power, present in virtue of knowledge. And presumably that's not the way in which the contents of space are present in space. Presumably, you know, the particles, well, of course we have pan-experientialism and so on, but I wasn't thinking that the particles would be present at a place because they know stuff about that place. No, they're present in a more direct sort of way. So the question has arisen recently in the work of Hudson, Alex Pruss, and others, whether we could suppose that God's presence is just one of these very fundamental relations that hold between particles in space. And if not, why not? And they can plausibly go back to the medievals, and for instance, Jeff Brower has made this argument that Aquinas held that God is as really present in spatial locations, according to Aquinas, as souls and angels, which are supposed to be filling, the soul of my body is supposed to fill the whole place where my body is, and that's not in a derivative sense. So you can make a good case that people used to think omnipresence was much more than this derivative kind of thing. It was a fundamental relation. So can we make use of this Parsons fundamental relation to make sense of God's omnipresence? So that's one question that I want to raise. Now there's an alternative theory of location and sort of a big controversy between the Parsons people and this other group. And this is section 2 on your handout there. So I've presented Parsons as defining everything in terms of weak location, and the result is a notion of exact location that automatically takes up gives you the biggest region that you occupy. They have a notion of exact location, which I'm going to call locally exact location. Hudson introduces it. Maybe he was first. I'm not sure. Cody Gilmore definitely is an early adopter. Chris McDaniel as well. They take as their fundamental location relation one that satisfies the following two conditions. One, a thing can locally exactly occupy more than one region. So that means it's not Parsons' notion of a maximally exact location relation. It's more like being wholly located within. So you throw the particle into the time machine and you bring it back, and you've got it in one box. You also have it in the other box, and they are going to say, likely, we'll see that they don't have to say this, but they're going to say it's exactly located here. It's exactly located here in two different places. So it's clearly not Parsons' notion of exact location. They also think that, two, a thing does not automatically locally exactly occupy subregions of a region it locally exactly occupies. So that means it's not pervasion either. So a thing can be locally exactly here. Let's start thinking about spheres. They're very helpful. So you've got a spherical object, and they want to say an object can be locally exactly there, and not locally exactly at any of the subregions inside. They're willing to consider extended simples, things that have no parts but fill up a region of space. Now that should sound weird and controversial. What leads them to say it? Well, it's things like, you got a fundamental relation here. It should be able to hold between a thing and all different kinds of places. And they tend to be kind of Humean about possibilities. And they think when you get to the fundamental level, you should have recombinable properties and relations. So they're willing to say, you've got this simple thing. It locally exactly occupies a spherical region, and it's not anywhere locally exactly inside there either. It just fills the sphere, pervades it in some sense, but not by virtue of having parts inside there. Okay. So they can define weak location. There's a definition of it there. A notion of weak location that behaves just like Parsons is supposed to behave. So let's call their version of weak location D6 here. Let's spell it out this way. R overlaps a region at which X is locally exactly located, period. Okay, so that's going to give them a notion of weak location by means of which they could define all the Parsons notions. So they have a notion of exact location that behaves like Parsons, but they also have this other one that behaves differently. Okay. Now, why do they want this? I mean, if the Parsons picture gives you a lot of relations, and you can take one of them as your most fundamental one. You might argue about which one is the best candidate. But it gives you a bunch of nice relations. Why do they think that we need yet another? Occasionally, they talk as though it's just to let 1,000 flowers bloom. Maybe the fundamental location relation behaves in this stipulated way. But more often, they talk about shape. And they try to get us in the swing of what they're doing by talking about the shapes of things. So let's go back to a sphere. Suppose you've got a hemisphere, and let's suppose it's an extended simple hemisphere. So you've got this object that has no parts, but somehow it's shaped like a hemisphere. You send it into the time machine, it goes back, and eventually meets its earlier self, and bang, they glom together, and you've got something that looks spherical, but it's the same damn thing in two places, right? They say things like this, and I think you don't have to believe in time travel for this to, or the possibility even of time travel to kind of get the feel for this, I think. They say, well, look, the thing is really only ever shaped like a hemisphere, and it just happened to be next to itself. So they'll say things like, nothing here is spherical in shape. There's just one thing, and it's shaped like a hemisphere twice over. Okay, so that's the sort of picture that they've got, and so they are tying in some way this locally exact location relation to the shapes of objects. So if you've got a thing that stands in the locally exact relation to some region, the thing automatically has the shape of that region. But you could have a thing that pervades a region but doesn't have the shape of that region. Obvious examples are, I pervade the space that has my big toe in it, but I'm not locally exactly there, and I'm not shaped like a big toe. Right. But locally exact location is supposed to bring shape with it. Okay. Now, once you've got this picture, you can define up different ways for an extended simple to fill spaces. Now, I didn't read this out, and I should have. On page 1, D4 there, this gives us a relationship in Parsons' framework that allows for a being like God is supposed to be, simple and everywhere. So it's a notion that the philosopher Henry Moore called holomerism, a kind of way of filling up a space, the whole in the whole and the whole in each part, or at least not parts for the different subparts. So X holomerically fills R means that X has no proper parts, R is a non-point-sized region, and X pervades R. So if something can do that, it's an extended simple. It's a simple that's spread out somehow. Now, what the second theory of locally exact location allows for is more than one way of holomerically filling a region. So, in fact, it offers many, many different ways, because this locally exact relation could hold many times over between a thing and an extended region, or it could hold just once to the whole region. So here are a couple extremes. The first extreme kind of holomerically filling is what I'm calling extremely entending. And I really, really hate the technical terminology that's used in this literature, but it's pervasive and we're stuck with it. I could tell you where it comes from. There's this distinction that Mark Johnston drew and David Lewis made use of between enduring through time and perduring through time. And in Lewis's way of understanding it anyway, perduring is having different temporal parts at different times. So you fill a temporal region by having different temporal parts for the different subregions. But enduring is supposed to be a different kind of lasting, a way of lasting through time without being divided up like that. So the enduring and perduring then gets translated over into the spatial case, and you have these expressions entending, which is a kind of extending, where you don't have parts for the subparts, and pertending, which is like the worst ever because it sounds like pretending. Pertending is being extended parts outside of parts, as the medievals would have said. different parts for every subregion. Okay, so that's the language we're stuck with. Extreme entending, as I define it here, is a case where you've got a simple, it has no parts, it's locally exactly located at every subregion of R, including R itself. And I should have said R is an extended region. So if you've got this simple that's extremely intending a sphere, it's locally exactly located at the center point. It's locally exactly located at the entire region and at each hemisphere, every way of cutting it. So if shape goes with locally exact location, then the object has all these shapes, even though it's simple. The contrast, the very other end of the spectrum, has been called spanning. And that's at the top of the page 2. I think Hudson gave it this name, and it's a pretty good name, actually. Spanning is good. So a thing spans an extended region R means that it has no parts, it's locally exactly occupied, locally exactly located at R, and at no proper subregions of R. So you've got an extended region, the thing fills that, and it's locally exactly occupying that region, and it doesn't stand in this exact location relation to any of the subregions. Okay. So what we've got here, if we're thinking about omnipresence, we've got some options now. We've got one theory about what the exact, what the fundamental location relation is like, and it doesn't allow for a thing to be exactly located here and exactly located there. If it's holonumerically filling a region, that's what it does, and that's it. The other way of thinking about location gives us all these other possibilities. Now, I'm a bit, I kind of get nervous about this sort of thing, and it's like, are these really distinct possibilities? I start to lose my grip a little bit. You send the hemisphere into the time machine, and in the past it shows up. You've got the very same thing, and all of a sudden, boom! Isn't it spherical? I mean, if I'm going to catch it, I better treat it like it's a sphere. So I sometimes worry that we've got, that this is one distinction too many. But let's let's keep it on the table. And if we're thinking about omnipresence, we are going to be wondering which of these location relations is the best to make sense of a deity that is as literally located in every space as any field or object. Now, one of the questions we're going to wonder about is whether such a being would then have to have a shape. Now, the second location theory really ties the fundamental location relation to shape and says, if you stand in this relation to a region, then you've got the shape of that region. And so if, as in some models of space-time, space is actually finite and growing, space itself, then if God is everywhere in the fundamental sense, if God's exactly located, locally exactly located at the biggest region, spans that region, then God is growing. Now, in a room with quite a few Whiteheadians, this is probably perfectly fine. What's the problem? Yeah. So yeah, it's okay. But other people might worry about it. And what I want to say is, well, yeah, I don't know how worried about it I am. And a lot of what I'm doing here is like for the benefit of others. Like you might want these tools. But some of the people who hold, who make use of this exact location relation are, they also hold an extrinsic theory about shape. So if they hold that kind of view about shape, then this might not be such a crazy thing, even for people who have anxieties about whether God is in time and changing intrinsically. So let me spell out this extrinsic theory of shape. The extrinsic theory of shape can be made use of by both Parsons and the other folk. It's not proprietary. Here's McDaniel's statement of it. According to the extrinsic theory, the shape of a material object is not an intrinsic property of that object, as is sometimes supposed. Instead, the shape of a material object is an extrinsic property. Specifically, the shape of a material object is an extrinsic property had by that object in virtue of its occupying a region of space, or space-time, which has that shape intrinsically. We can think of the shape of an object as the sum of those features of an object that are determined by its geometrical features. So its topological structure, affine structure, metrical structure, etc. Each structure is exemplified by a material object only if it occupies a region that exemplifies that structure. The fact that a material object has a shape is constituted by the fact that it bears a relation to a region of space that has that shape. And the relation he thinks is the one that ensures the thing has the shape is locally exactly occupying a region. So you don't get the shape of a region just by pervading it, because that's not your real shape if you stick out. You don't get the shape of a region just because you're entirely in that region. You might be smaller than that region. Okay, so it's locally exact location, which he thinks gives a thing its extrinsic shape. Now, Parsons could also adopt an extrinsic theory about shape. So far as I know, he didn't pronounce on that question. But it's appealing to people because it cuts down on what seemed to some people like surprising or unexplained necessities. So you can't put a square peg in a round hole. You can't put a square peg in a spherical region of space. Unless it's as long as it's a small sphere. But if the location relation is a really fundamental relation, and if the objects, the space occupiers, are fundamental, and if the space itself is a fundamental entity, then people who like Humean theories of necessity are going to say, hey, these should be recombinable every which way you like. And so you should be able to put this square peg in the round or in the spherical hole. And this bothers them. Well, if you say that actually, the sense in which the peg is square, if it is square, that's a very extrinsic fact about it. It's not a fundamental fact. It's a fact about its relationship to a region. So the mysterious necessity has gone away. That's the reason Chris McDaniel likes this account, at least one of the reasons, and others who advocate it as well. Now, here's where I'm going to go off script from the last time I gave this talk. We'll see if this is a big mistake, but it's some stuff that I've been thinking about because of all the Whiteheadians around me. There's a kind of So there's this pressure to think these are fundamental entities, and there should be possibilities of recombination. So you should be able to put this thing, the square peg, in any region whatsoever, because these are the location relation is fundamental, and you should be able to swap things around. That if you think that its squareness or its cubicalness is really intrinsic to it, you shouldn't be able to put it into a spherical region that's small. So that's why we treat it as extrinsic. Now there's a competing intuition, which is expressed nicely by Cody Gilmore, which is, and he appeals to David Lewis here, it's the idea that shape, real shape, is always intrinsic. There's no such thing as extrinsic shape. And so if an object, a space occupier, something that isn't identical with a region of space, can have a shape at all, it's got to be able to have a shape intrinsically. And then we're going to have brute, well, not brute, I mean, it feels like they have good explanations, necessities about what kind of regions it can occupy. And I have to admit, I find this idea kind of appealing. Especially because I take the job of kind of figuring out what the fundamental facts are about space and time and matter as an attempt to provide metaphysical systems for physical theories. And if it doesn't make sense with a physical theory, well, then it's a bad metaphysics for that theory. So I'm kind of a let a thousand flowers bloom kind of person. So I think a kind of plenum theory of space that could have turned out to be true, and it might still, it might still turn out to be like the best deal. So that the fundamental thing that's out there is more like a field or a plenum, and it's got many properties, not just metrical properties. And if you can have things that are shaped that don't coincide with, don't borrow their shape from an underlying substantival space-time, well, then things can have shape intrinsically without having it in virtue of being related to space. So I'm kind of in Cody's camp here. Another big question here is, what are the properties of a plenum or space or an extended simple that give it its shape? And they can't be unrelated to the metrical properties of the points in space or the metrical properties of the points in a plenum. If you fix all of the facts about path lengths within a region, you're going to determine its exact shape. So all the path lengths, you figure out what the shortest distance is between here and here by looking at all the paths you could take from there to there. So one very plausible idea is path length is more fundamental than shape. But if that were the case, then extended simples that don't borrow their shape from space or a plenum, that doesn't make sense, because they don't have parts that have lengths inside them. There's no paths in there. At least there's no parts of the simple. So that has made me attracted to a view which I think can be found in the medievals too, which is the real shapes, the intrinsic shapes, are only had by things like space, which has parts for every, for every distance. There's more parts in between the distances. So you really need all of that structure in order to have shapes. You can derivatively have a shape by standing in a location relation to something that has a shape in that sense. Okay, so that's kind of appealing to me, but here's where Whitehead comes in. Whitehead's method of extensive abstraction was, as you all know, a way of doing away with points and less than three-dimensional regions if we just think about the spatial case. He thought that we shouldn't think of the points of space as fundamental entities. They're very derivative. You can think about, they're so derivative that you can sort of think about them in arbitrarily many different ways. There's arbitrarily many different nested sets of objects that hone in on what you would want to call the same point. Now, if that is a possible kind of space, and it intuitively is, it feels to me, then the shapes of objects and the shapes of a descending series of spheres, for instance, can't be given to them or determined by relations between points, because the points are derivative things. So I'm, I really invite input here from people who've thought about Whitehead much harder and longer than I have. But it feels to me like if that is your fundamental theory of the nature of points of space, you shouldn't say that the basic properties that give regions their shape are distances or path lengths between points. So this is a point at which I'm torn in a number of different directions. Okay. So Cody, anyway, is inclined to say something that's in keeping, or he says something that's in keeping with this picture, where you can have a sphere, it's spherical, and it's not spherical because it's got parts that are related in certain ways. It's just spherical, period. He's inclined to think objects have their shape intrinsically, regions of space have their shape intrinsically. So objects are like pegs, and they've got to fit into holes in space, regions of space that are appropriate. Other people, like Chris McDaniel, people with this extrinsic theory of location, they take the space occupiers to be kind of like blobs. The blobs that in themselves don't have a particular shape. They get their shape derivatively by standing in this location relation to a region with that shape. So two different views. When I'm thinking in a Whiteheadian sort of way, I'm kind of veering towards Cody's peg picture. Okay. Now on the peg picture, though, it doesn't follow that things couldn't have shape extrinsically as well. And this is where I think the medieval picture is helpful. They tended to say things like matter fills space by having extensive quantity of various kinds of quantity. In order to do this, it has to have parts outside of parts. It has to have parts that stand in relations. It has to be fully spread out. Other things like souls, angels, and God can fill a region in a different way, and they're not extended in the same way, but they're still precise regions that they occupy. So if you think that the soul is extended throughout the body, well, then that's the shape of my soul. But it doesn't have that shape in the same way that the matter does. So I think you could have a view here where material things have shape intrinsically. They can only fit into places in space that have the shape that they have. Meanwhile, souls and other things that don't have parts outside of parts only fill regions in this extrinsic sort of way. And at this moment, that all sounds plausible to me, and maybe that's even my view. I don't know, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Now, I think the idea that God is a spanner and only or otherwise whole and merically filling all of space, but only extrinsically has the shape of space, if space has a finite shape. I feel like that should not bother people who want to say God is also timeless. Now, I'm not a timelessness kind of guy. I'm with Godey. The future's open. God's moving there along with us, and luring us along, and all of that. But I like to, be helpful, and I want to say the sense in which God would be shaped on this picture is extrinsic and shouldn't be regarded as dragging God down into time. Now, what do people mean when they say that God is timeless or outside of time? This is a kind of technical notion, a technical theological notion, and I think different people mean different things. But they mean at least that God occupies a standpoint that isn't a temporal one. So God can do things, act, create times. God can't create times from a time, they say. I think that was Augustine's big worry. So God has to be outside of time in order to create time. So it's a point of view, which is not a temporal point of view, from which God can act. Boethius was concerned about God's foreknowledge. So he said, God doesn't foreknow. God knows timelessly. So both of them explicitly treat time as timelessness as functioning like a time, but a time that's off of our temporal ordering. So it's something like a vantage point from which God knows, from which God acts. It's also connected with immutability, because if something changes, how could it not be in time? And some people have held that things can have both a timeless aspect and a temporal aspect. Godey mentioned William Lane Craig's view, which he's moved by Augustine's idea that God has to be able to create time. God couldn't create time at a time. So timelessly, there's got to be some act of creation that God performs, and in virtue of which there are times. But then Craig thinks, now God is just sort of puttering along with us. God knows what time it is. God knows what's happening now. I think there's like open stuff. There's no fact of the matter, so God doesn't know that stuff. So on that picture, God isn't just timeless. God also has a temporal aspect. So people who want to say God is really timeless, they're going to want to say the timelessness involves a vantage point that is off of our timeline, and it also involves not changing, at least not changing intrinsically. Okay. Now, I think it's important that they say not changing intrinsically, because otherwise they're going to be subject to this little argument on your handout. I'm skipping some of these definitions here. Just look at what's right in the middle of page 2, the atmospheric theory of being in time. This is something that actually I'm not sure that this is a bad argument, but if people who like timelessness are right, this better be a bad argument. If you hold an atmospheric theory of time, you think that once there's time, if there's time at all, if anything's changing, then boom, everything's in time. So here's this little argument. Premise 1, if anything changes, then everything that exists changes at least extrinsically. If something changes in any way, intrinsically or extrinsically, then it's in time. God exists and some things are changing, so God changes extrinsically, so God is in time. So the thought here is Cambridge change is enough to make you temporal. And, if I go from not loving God to loving God, then it's, if there is a God, then extrinsically God changed. So if you want to say God is timeless, you've got to deny that kind of extrinsic change is enough to make something temporal. And so if that's right, the real problem has to be intrinsic change, not just extrinsic change. On the Spanner view, or the Parsons-Holen-Merrick filling view of God's location, if you adopt the extrinsic theory of shape, you can say, yeah, if the universe were finite, God would be growing in a sense. But it's a very extrinsic sense, and not one that we should worry about. God acts from timeless eternity. God knows from timeless eternity, and those are the important things. Extrinsic change is no big deal. On this sort of view, we could have it literally true that in God we live and move and have our being. We could also have God knowing from and acting from a timeless perspective. Now, I personally don't care about saving that picture, but I know some people really, really do. And so, since I like to be helpful, I'm offering that to them as a theory of omnipresence. Thanks.
I don't have a question so much as a lot of comments and possible suggestions.
Great.
I don't know if they use this term, Parsons, Hudson, Gilmore, etc., but what they're doing is called Mariology.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, they absolutely they do.
First, okay, good. The other thing is that however the two spheres coming to mate with itself. Yeah. Which is get your kink where you can, I guess. For that, you need one more step, called what Whitehead invented called Mariotopology, because you need a theory of contact.
Right.
Contact.
Yeah.
One of the things.
And these guys are on top of that literature.
I'm sorry, I'm not myself familiar with it.
It too is a growing literature.
Thoroughly aside from everything, calling God a spanner, the British term for a spanner is what we call a monkey wrench.
Well, sometimes God does seem like a.
I'm gonna be laughing my whole.
It's literally what the word means in British English. A spanner is a monkey wrench.
A spanner in the works.
Yeah.
But so I mean that's
yeah.
You mentioned in here the different geometrical, rather perhaps spatial features, a topological affine structure, metrical structure. You should have a projective in between a topological and affine, just FYI. But these things are each different layers of logical assumptions.
Yeah.
By the time you get to metrical, you've got a ton of assumptions running with you, and you need and when you start talking about straight lines, you're assuming that metrical, which is not necessary. It's not. I mean, it's a logical addition, and it's not necessary.
Sure.
Whitehead's whole development in part 4 of flat loci is the idea of non-metrical straightness.
Yeah, I know these are separable notions. You can have a space in the abstract sense anyway that has just affine structure and not metrical structure and so on.
Topologically, this wine glass is indistinguishable from a tennis ball.
Yeah.
And so it's when they start talking about straight lines as being somehow essential, they're making they're bringing a lot of logical baggage into the picture that's not, but might be essential to this, well, what Whitehead would call a cosmic epoch
Yeah.
where we are currently living, but it's not logically necessary in itself.
Sure. Yes. I think that's very helpful to say, because I think the project here should be constructing myriotopology, a theory about the relationship between things and real space. And it should be an open question how much structure real space has.
We know that we can talk about the structure that our space has, at least as far as we have figured it out. I mean, there might be more that we have. There might be much that we have missed, and might be some things that we have.
There may be connections
that we have imported
that we don't know about.
But in terms of logically basic assumptions, they're starting at metrical space. They are starting deep down in it, and I mean, even if they're correct, it's because they're lucky, not because they're right.
Well, I think what they're trying to do is to take the theory of, in fact, space-time that they get from contemporary physics. Now, of course, it's not finished, and there's all kinds of problems. But take the one that they're given and say, okay, let's suppose that this is right, and that space-time does have this much structure, which is a lot. Now, what would it be for objects to get their shape from the space-time? Well, they must stand in some relationship to the parts of it. And then the question arises, is the shape of these space occupiers entirely derivative? And I think the natural thing to say is probably yes. You get your shape from the region that you occupy. But the Whiteheadian idea that it's possible for there to be a space without points, and that nevertheless has spheres, and nevertheless admits a great deal of, really I know Tarski's construction better, but it recovers all this straight line structure, and I think what they're trying to do is, let's take a kind of going physical theory about what structure space-time has, and think about what it, in what sense do other things have shapes?
Also, you mentioned in his theory, Whitehead's theory of extensive abstraction, about your term was sets.
Yeah.
Coming down. I would encourage you to avoid the term sets.
Yeah.
You might try the term extensa as a plural of extension.
Yeah.
Because sets imply individual, elemental members, atomic members, which do not exist in Whitehead's mereology. His mereology has no atoms. It's atomless. It's sometimes in some contemporary literature sometimes would be called an atomless gunk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And my right hand to God, I'm not making that up.
Oh, I know. I've got a paper with that in its title. I love that expression. It's amusing.
Yeah, I say it and I feel like I need to apologize to people. They really call it.
People really call it that.
Danica has a question.
All right. Hello. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around all of this, but I think my question remains on the whole and miracle. That's the idea that God pervades everything, right? Okay. Because I feel like the only
without having any parts.
Right. I feel like the only way this refutation works is because we're assuming God's whole and miracle. Why are we assuming God's whole and miracle as opposed to weakly located in both time and timelessness? Why are we treating time not as an additional kind of space here, and as well as timelessness as a separate kind of space? I'm thinking of this in the sense of people imagine heaven as separate from earth, and God pervading all of that, which would mean that God is weakly located in both heaven and earth.
Yeah, so so if there are, I mean, if there are other places, and if the timeless realm is another place, people who like omnipresence surely are going to want to say, God pervades that region too. So God whole and merically fills every region, no matter where it is. And there's this place in Anselm where he says something that sounds to me like God coincides with everything, including things that aren't spatial, so that there can be a kind of coincidence holding between non-spatial things. So I think that there isn't. You shouldn't think about the view that God whole and merically fills a space that's finite as ruling out God's actually whole and merically filling a bigger space, because maybe there's more universes, or maybe eternity counts as a kind of place.
But doesn't that bring us back to the question of creativity, in the sense that
That would be good if it did, because that's in the name of this.
So consider the idea that time creates space, which is a pretty fundamentally Whiteheadian idea. Time creates space.
Yeah.
It's not that there are spaces and then we use time to explain them. It is that time actually creates space. That would include the divine instance. Now, the divine is atemporal, and yet, and this is the Whiteheadian sort of dilemma that anybody who goes into Whiteheadian metaphysics has to encounter. It's like, yes, God is atemporal, but God is a slave to creativity just like everything else that is. And so therefore, if time is the first division of the extensive continuum, then every subsequent division is subordinate to time. And so there's no space we know that's not created by time, which is not to say that it has to be that way, only that it is that way. So time creates space is the point.
Yeah.
We don't know any other space, but we don't deny that there could be other spaces. But in our cosmic epoch, to use Whitehead's term, time creates space. And all our spaces are temporally created.
You know, I never got far enough into Whitehead to understand that
there's
saying.
no understanding it, it's an assertion.
Yeah, but I like to.
You either sort of buy it or you don't.
Yeah.
But
Well, but there is something that that has made me. Well, it's given me a way of understanding that kind of saying that is intriguing, at least. So if you take and this actually would be a very Whiteheadian idea, a very early Whiteheadian idea. If you take the paths, like point particle paths, as more fundamental than point events, right? So you think of them as space-time trajectories. And this was, I was assured by Tim Maudlin that this was true. That if you fix all the facts about the light cones and which paths intersect which other paths, you recover the spatial geometry of all the slices. So just
that's the
using
basic idea, yes.
Yeah, just using the light cone structure, which is all temporal. It's either the the paths of light or the paths of slower things, and that astonished me, and it sort of feels like then spatial, the spatial structure could be less fundamental than the facts about temporal paths. So,
Welcome to the Whiteheadian universe.
yeah, I like that idea.
You'll
Yeah. Yeah.
So, if God is at any point in space fully there, not partially, would that, I mean, what this raises all kinds of theological questions, because
Not comfortable ones either.
there is really no room, metaphorically speaking, for any creaturely existence or power or creativity. So such a God is absolutely overpowering,
Well,
it seems to me.
I mean, why does being located somewhere entail, controlling what happens there? And I don't see that. Something could be located somewhere, but
What does it mean
withhold.
that the
power.
Almighty and All-Powerful is located at a certain point and then still limited by the actions of others at the same point? I don't get it. So if God is really determining everything at every point by being fully present as the absolute, then everything else is practically gone. So there is. So I like the retraction, the Zimmerman.
Yeah.
And so that something doesn't feel right.
Yeah. Well, I kind of like Zimzum too, although there's subtleties about how to pronounce it. And so whenever I pronounce it, our Jewish grad students at Rutgers kind of laugh because it sounds like it sounds wrong. But I like the Zimzum idea too. And you could quite literally have that sort of picture with this theory about God's location and say, look, it's an extrinsic fact about God that God decided to have a big hole inside God, a big hole for creation. And so there was a literal withdrawal. So God's shaped like a infinitely large Swiss cheese with one hole, a donut. Well, yeah, not exactly. More of this, like, and Luria was accused of treating God like a big material object with a hole. An Islamic philosopher, Taimiyya, is that his name? I have him in here somewhere. Treated God like that because he thought it would be inappropriate for God to be located down here, and he thought anywhere you are on the sphere, you could point up and say that's where God is. So the result was God surrounded creation, but wasn't present in creation. And of course, they were both accused of saying you think God's a big material object. I think the extrinsicness of the shape relation should mitigate that concern. But I don't really see why spanning means that God must be controlling everything that happens at every point. Like when we think about, fairy tale stuff like ghosts passing through you, the ghost passes through you and has no effect on you.
If the nature of something is like light, it's being, and it permeates something at every point fully, so it follows that the entire medium, the entire shape is fully illuminated, and there's just no room for darkness. And in the same metaphor, we're talking metaphors here because that's all these metaphors of course don't work for God really, but if God is the all-powerful, all-determining entity at every point, similar, if there is maximal light at every point, there's no room for darkness. And so if God's power is spatially located at every point, there is no, it seems to me, no room for the activity of anything else. That might be a fallacious thought, and somebody pointed out, but it's an intuition I have.
Yeah, I guess I don't see why God couldn't be filling this room but hidden from us. And some things are too big to see.
That strikes me as a great point to end this discussion. Some things are too big to see. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you. Thanks very much. This was really fun.